Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into how the United Nations has finally decided who is Indigenous. Let's get started. A number of episodes ago, we spoke about the talking point that the Zionists are colonizers. And we got a lot of feedback from that episode in regards to taking down these talking points and giving you a little bit of information that will help you debunk these things. This week's episode, I thought I would take on the typical talking point of the Palestinian Arabs being an indigenous people to the land. And contrarily, the idea that the Jewish people are not indigenous to the land. I think for this episode, I'm not going to get too much into the DNA and all of the claims made by the Palestinian Arabs to have DNA from the Levant or the DNA of Philistines or Canaanites or all of these pretty much fully debunked ideas. Maybe we can leave that to another episode. But on this episode, I want to focus solely on the idea of an indigenous people by the United Nations definition. And by the end, we'll see if the Palestinian Arabs of today are considered to be an indigenous peoples, or if the Jewish people are considered to be an indigenous people. A little bit of background on where this definition is going to come from. In the United Nations General Assembly on September 13th, 2007, the United Nations officially adopted Resolution 61/295, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now, for any of my listeners who know the United Nations, you will know that this was absolutely not created to be used for the Jewish people, because according to the United Nations, Israel is some sort of colonizer state and not indigenous. This is intended to create an official definition for the First Nations of Canada, First Nations of America, First Nations of Australia, in order to recognize what constitutes an indigenous people to a land. In an incredibly ironic twist, at the fact that this supposedly doesn't apply to the Jews, but we'll talk about that later. In Article 3, it states, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Ironically, if we find out that the Jews are an indigenous people, the UN also finds the self-determination of those Jews as some type of racism. But everyone else, it's okay when they self-determine. Also mentioned in the United Nations resolution is Article 6, that every indigenous individual has the right to a nationality, and therefore some type of statehood. And Article 7 most notably says, in Part 1, an indigenous individual has the right to life, physical, mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. And 2, indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as a distinct people, and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of that group by another group. In Article 10, it specifically says that indigenous peoples shall not be forcefully removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without their free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous people. And lastly, Article 26, Section 1 says that indigenous peoples have the right to the lands and territories and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. At this point, while I'm speaking, you probably are thinking to yourself, does this fit the Jewish people? And therefore, are we fulfilling that requirement under the UN? Or does it fit the Palestinian Arabs, all of these rights for the indigenous people? So first thing I think we have to do here is look through the 7 things that the United Nations says are characteristics of what makes an indigenous peoples. And I guess we'll have to decide which side fits the definition more closely or at all. Characteristic number 1, according to the United Nations, is self-identification and community acceptance. Individuals must identify as an indigenous peoples and be recognized as a member of an indigenous community. So if we start off with, let's say, the Jewish community, the Jewish community pretty much since its beginning has understood itself and its story as originating from the land of Israel. Despite all of the exiles and any kind of ways that we've been kicked out of the land, there is no doubt that the Jewish people have ever doubted that they came from Judea, Israel, and that we are a distinct group of people from that land. I don't think there would be much evidence, if any, of a Jewish community anywhere in the world claiming that they had no connection to the land of Israel. That is such a unique and fundamental part of Judaism. Now, if we were to use that same criteria for, let's say, the Palestinian Arabs, we'll see how it fits their claims. Historically speaking, there literally was no Palestine. We've talked about that on this podcast before. The only time a quote-unquote Palestine existed was between 1917 and 1947, because the British called it Palestine. And under the Palestinian name, technically speaking, it was Jews, Christians, Bedouins, Druze, and Arabs all living in the land called by the British Palestinian people. So technically speaking, the quote-unquote Palestinians of today weren't the only Palestinians at the time, if they even called themselves that, which they didn't. If you look at the 1937 Peel Commission report, this was commissioned by the British to look at the land and decide how to break it up between the Muslims and the Jews. The Arabs were incredibly clear about what they thought of Palestine. They didn't believe themselves to be Palestinian. They didn't believe the land to be called Palestine. They considered it, under the Muslim occupation, to be Syria, which is what it used to be called before the British took it over. And they considered themselves to be South Syrian Arabs, not Palestinians. So according to the United Nations definition of self-identifying as a unique people, they don't qualify because they didn't see themselves as a unique people. They saw themselves as Arabs, like all of the other Arabs, from a country called Syria. And in the second part of this definition by the United Nations, it is clear that nobody else considered them to be Palestinians. The other Arab groups literally didn't see them as anything other than Arabs living in southern Syria. So they didn't self-identify as an indigenous people, and no one outside of the group identified them as an indigenous people. So they don't really qualify under the first characteristic of an indigenous people, but the Jewish people do. The second characteristic offered by the United Nations is a historical continuity. There must be a link to pre-colonial or pre-settler societies. So if we start again with the Jewish people, it is pretty clear that the Jewish people were the only people on that land that had a sovereign nation before colonization. Nobody denies that the Greeks colonized, then the Jews got it back, then the Romans colonized, then the Christians took over for the Romans, then the Muslims took over, the Ottomans, the British, and so on. The only people that had a legitimate claim pre-colonization was the Jews. Whereas if we look at, let's say, the Palestinian Arabs and their claim to the land, the Arab people who came in during the 7th century, the Arab conquest of the Middle East and North Africa, are not indigenous. They came in during a colonization, not pre-colonization. And at no point was there a, quote, Palestinian people living in this area as a sovereign nation. Some online do try and make the claim of these were indigenous people that were converted to Islam, and therefore they are still technically indigenous. People like the Jews, the Samaritans, the Bedouins. But once these people were colonized, and yes, some Judean or Jewish people did convert to Islam and are now, quote-unquote, Palestinians, but we'll get to this talking point later. So for this point, we have a group of people, the Jews, who have an unbroken link to the Jewish nations that were sovereign in this land, versus the Palestinian Arabs, who may or may not have come in during a colonization or being colonized by that colonization. Seems like the Jewish people definitely have a better claim for indigenous status than the Palestinian Arabs. UN characteristic number 3, strong connection to territory and resources. Indigenous peoples have a deep connection to the land and its resources. This time, let's start with the Palestinian Arabs. You can make a very loose claim that they do have a tie to that land and to that territory. There is some history there of the Arabs in the land, not yet called Palestinian, but they had been there since the Arab conquest, and therefore they do have some tie to the land. So when you look at this specific one, maybe somebody could make the claim that the Palestinian Arabs do have a tie to this specific land. However, it is pretty interesting when talking about an importance of a land in the fact that the Palestinian Arabs literally didn't have any borders for their supposed land. How important could a land be to a bunch of people who can't show you what the border was? The borders that most of you know for ancient Palestine were created by the colonizing powers when trying to split Israel from Jordan. They were not at all based on historical borders or boundaries. So if you ask a Palestinian Arab today, they couldn't tell you what the borders were of a supposed land called Palestine. Contrarily, you have the Jewish people who have tons of maps over thousands and thousands of years of the different Israelite kingdoms, Judean kingdoms, Hasmonean kingdoms, or even the semi-autonomous Roman kingdom under King Herod. We have all of these maps. We know what the land looked like and who owned what. And within that land, we see Jewish relics everywhere. Synagogues and temples and historical mosaics that say the Jewish people were here. So on the one hand, you have the Jewish people who have tons of history in the land. The land is important to their religion, their faith. All of the Jewish holidays revolve around the seasons of Israel. And then you have the Palestinian Arabs who don't even have a map of their supposedly very important land. So I guess we can chalk that one up to both sides have a point, but the Jewish one is a little bit stronger. The fourth point made by the United Nations is a distinct social, economic, and political system. Indigenous groups have a unique way of organizing themselves socially, economically, and politically. By this, I'm assuming what they're suggesting is that an indigenous people has a slightly different way of setting themselves apart than the surrounding people. So, for example, you have the Jewish people throughout colonization maintaining a Jewish lifestyle, maintaining Jewish customs, and keeping the organization of the tribal way that Judeans always lived, even in the diaspora. There is no question that the Jewish people all around the world and within Israel during colonization were always different from their colonizers or the people they lived around. It's kind of why they kept trying to kill us all the time. On the other hand, when you look at the Palestinian Arabs, who again didn't call themselves Palestinian, they had no differences between them and the other Arabs. The Jordanian Arabs were no different than their friends on the other side of the Jordan River. The supposed Palestinian Arabs within southern Syria didn't consider themselves any different than the Syrian Arabs. And before the 1960s, when the Palestinian identity was formed and created, nobody thought they were anything different than the rest of the Arabs. In fact, when you look at the British when they were trying to fight the Ottoman Empire using the Arabs for help, what the Arabs asked for was a unified Arab state once the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. The Arabs themselves didn't ask for a Jordan and an Iraq and a Lebanon and a Palestine. They wanted one singular state under a Muslim caliphate, just like the time when the Muslims ruled the whole area before the Ottomans. It was actually under the Sykes-Picot Agreement where the British and the French screwed over the Arabs and decided to, instead of giving them one state for Arabs, create all of the other random states that they just decided to make up on a map, which included Palestine. So it is very difficult to make the claim for the Palestinian Arabs that they had any type of distinct social or economic difference from the other Arabs in the region. They were the same. So under this characteristic, it seems like the Jewish people are definitely indigenous, whereas the Palestinian Arabs are not. UN characteristic number 5, distinct language, culture, and beliefs. Indigenous people maintain a distinct cultural practice and tradition, including languages and beliefs. For this one, it's pretty easy and clear to see the Jewish people as an indigenous people. There are so few Jewish people around that you can only find them at the time in Judea. That was until, of course, they were exiled everywhere. But still, it is a minority of people. And the Jewish people, no matter where they went around the world, always had a distinct language, whether that was Hebrew or Yiddish or Ladino, and obviously had different cultures and beliefs than the people they were around, other than when they were in Judea, their homeland. If we look at the Palestinian Arabs, it's a little different because, as I said, they were no different than any other Arab group around. They all spoke the same language. They all had pretty much the same culture, with some minor variances depending on where they were in the world. And their beliefs were Islam and all the same. So if we look at the two compared to one another, you've got the Jews within Judea being an island among itself, surrounded by other pagan religions. And even in the diaspora, they were a small island among Christians and Muslims and a bunch of other people. Whereas the Palestinian Arabs, in their own supposed country of Palestine, they were no different than anybody else in the area. They were indistinguishable from a Jordanian or a Syrian. And if those Palestinian Arabs moved to a different country, like Egypt or Jordan, they could get along just fine. So if you look at this characteristic by the United Nations and compare the two peoples, clearly the Jewish people are indigenous and the Palestinian Arabs are not. United Nations characteristic number 6, non-dominant group status. Indigenous peoples are typically marginalized or discriminated against by the dominant society. I think this one goes without saying for the Palestinian Arabs. Just like in the last few, they were no different than the people around them. So they are not necessarily a minority, especially because they didn't consider themselves to be Palestinian until the 1960s, well after colonization, which was an earlier point that had to be fulfilled. Yes, they became a minority currently in modern day after they invented themselves to be a minority and to be unique or different from everyone around them, but it had to have happened pre-colonization in order to be considered an indigenous people. I also don't think I need to spend too much time on the Jewish people and how they are actually a minority in the world. Even when they were living in the land under the Muslim rulers, they were a minority among the influx of Arab and now Christian colonizers who entered the land. So I think this point goes without much saying that the Jewish people clearly are more minority than the Palestinian Arabs, and therefore fulfill this requirement of being an indigenous people. The last and most important 7th characteristic of the United Nations is resolve to maintain their identity. Indigenous peoples are committed to preserving their unique identities and ways of life. If we look at the Arabs, they really didn't have a unique identity to hold on to. They made it up in the 1960s. So since then, sure, they've tried to maintain some type of identity, but it's fairly indistinguishable from the other Arabs in the area. For example, the Jordanians, who are actually Palestinian themselves. So this one is a little bit difficult because they are attempting now to maintain an identity that was created in the 1960s, but before that, they had no identity. So I guess it's partially true, but only since the 1960s. Whereas you have the Jewish people who have gone back for thousands of years and maintained against all odds their identity. If you think about the Babylonian exile, which could have destroyed the Jewish people, and yet they maintained that identity in Babylon and then came back to Israel, many of them. You have the Roman exile, which sent a whole bunch of Jews up to Europe for thousands of years under the worst circumstances of being kicked out of countries, mistreated, murdered on many occasions. And they still maintained a unique identity. And the same goes for Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, who against many odds maintained a unique culture and identity in their diaspora lives. So on the one hand, you have the Palestinian Arabs who created an identity and then have kind of held on to it a little bit, mostly for political reasons and for refugee status, even though their way of life is no different than any other Arabs in the region. And then you have the Jewish people who have spent thousands and thousands of years trying to maintain their culture and their religion, and not to mention their hope to go home to their indigenous homeland. And this last and 7th point is incredibly important for this argument, because the maintaining of your religion is key and vital to an indigenous people. So those who like to pretend that the Palestinians are actually Philistines, or the Palestinians are Canaanites, or the Palestinians are some other peoples that were from the land that had been colonized by the Arabs, this last point proves that even if any of that was true, and most of it isn't, It means you are no longer indigenous because you no longer maintain a unique identity. Once an indigenous people takes on their colonizer identity, they take on a language, they give up their culture, and they give up self-identifying as an indigenous peoples. According to the United Nations, you are no longer classified as indigenous. So this point alone, made by the United Nations, clearly states that a person who has been colonized, who has now taken on a non-minority, non-distinct identity, who considers themselves now to be one and the same as everybody else in a region, is no longer classified as an indigenous person. In the end, the idea of this podcast was to show you that the United Nations has put out a list of what counts as an indigenous people. And even though it was not intended to prove an indigenous status for Jews of the land, it accidentally did. And the irony in the fact that many people around the world, including people at the United Nations, try and pretend that the Palestinian Arabs and their fake history that they try and present classifies it as an indigenous people. You have just seen in this podcast how it doesn't quite fit the UN's own definitions. And we started this podcast by mentioning the articles of this UN resolution that suggest for any indigenous people that these people should be feeling safe and secure in their land. They have a right to nationality and self-determination and cannot be removed from their ancestral homeland. They have a right to live peacefully in their land, free of genocide and violent attacks, which sadly seems to go against the United Nations' current stance on the State of Israel. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.